The camera zooms in on a 57-year-old man named Harold Pemberton, sitting in his leather recliner, beer in hand, watching the evening news. His weathered face goes pale as the anchor announces, "Tonight, we celebrate Dr. Marcus Washington, the youngest neurosurgeon to successfully separate conjoined twins at Johns Hopkins Hospital." At just 32 years old, Dr. Washington has revolutionized pediatric surgery and saved countless lives. Harold's beer bottle slips from his trembling fingers and crashes to the floor as the camera pans to show Dr. Marcus Washington, a confident, articulate black man with Harold's exact same eyes, the same crooked smile, the same dimpled chin. The reporter continues. Dr. Washington credits his success to overcoming tremendous odds, including growing up without a father who abandoned him and his mother when he was just 7 years old. Harold's breathing becomes shallow. His vision blurs. The remote control falls from his hand as he whispers to the empty room. That's my boy, that's my Marcus." And then Harold Pemberton, the man who walked away from his own son 35 years ago because he couldn't handle the judgment, the stares, the whispers about his white wife and black child, collapses unconscious in his chair. This is the story of a father's cowardice, a son's triumph, and a truth that would shake both their worlds forever. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. I know you have countless options for your time, and I'm truly grateful you chose to spend it here with me. If this story moves you, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what part of the world you're watching from. Your support means everything to this channel. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. 1973, Millbrook, Alabama, a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where Sunday church attendance was mandatory, and where mixing races was still whispered about in hushed, scandalized tones. Harold Pemberton was 22, fresh out of community college with a business degree, and dreams bigger than his small-town upbringing. He worked at his father's hardware store by day, and spent his evenings at the local diner, where he first laid eyes on Celestine Williams, a stunning young black woman who had just moved to town to teach at the elementary school. Celestine was everything Harold had never expected to fall for. She was educated, articulate, and carried herself with a grace that made every room she entered seem brighter. But more than that, she saw something in Harold that even he didn't know existed, a kindness beneath his rough exterior, a depth beyond his small-town limitations. Their courtship was conducted in secret. Stolen moments at the library where Celestine would help Harold with his reading. He'd always struggled with dyslexia but was too proud to admit it. Quiet walks by the creek on the outskirts of town where they could hold hands without fear of judgment. Late-night phone calls where they'd talk about everything and nothing until the sun came up. For 8 months, they built a world together in the shadows. Harold had never felt more alive, more himself, than when he was with Celestine. She challenged him intellectually, supported his dreams of opening his own construction business, and loved him with a fierce loyalty that made him feel invincible. But small towns have big ears, and eventually, word got back to Harold's father, Theodore Pemberton, a man whose prejudices ran as deep as the Confederate flag hanging in his garage. The confrontation was brutal. Theodore didn't just threaten to disown Harold, he threatened to destroy Celestine's teaching career, to run her out of town, to make sure she never worked again. "You're going to ruin everything we've built," Theodore spat. "Everything our family has worked for. And for what? For some colored girl who'll never be accepted in our world." But love, they say, conquers all. And for a brief, shining moment, it did. Harold proposed to Celestine on a cold December night in 1973. And despite every odds stacked against them, despite every whisper and stare and threat, she said yes. They married in a small ceremony at a black church across town, with only Celestine's family present. Harold's entire family boycotted the wedding, and most of the white community treated them as pariahs. But they had each other, and Harold believed that would be enough. For 7 years it was. Marcus Celestine Washington Pemberton was born on a sweltering July day in 1976. He came into the world with his father's stubborn streak and his mother's brilliant mind, a beautiful blend of both his parents' best qualities. Harold fell in love the moment he held his son. Marcus had Harold's dimpled chin and crooked smile, but Celestine's deep, intelligent eyes and her father's strong jawline. He was perfect, a living testament to the love Harold and Celestine had built together. For the first few years of Marcus's life, they managed to create a bubble of happiness. Harold's construction business was thriving. Celestine had been promoted to principal of the elementary school, and Marcus was growing into a precocious, brilliant little boy who could read by age 4 and solve complex puzzles that stumped adults. But bubbles, no matter how beautiful, are fragile things. The breaking point came when Marcus was 7 years old. He had been invited to a birthday party at the country club, the first time any child in their family had been welcomed into Millbrook's most exclusive social circle. The invitation came from Tommy Richardson, whose father owned the biggest construction company in 3 counties and had been Harold's biggest competitor. Harold should have been suspicious. In retrospect, he realized it was all a setup. But at the time, he was so proud, so hopeful that maybe things were finally changing, that he dressed Marcus in his best clothes and walked him into that country club with his head held high. The humiliation was swift and brutal. The moment Harold and Marcus walked into the party, conversations stopped. Children stared, parents whispered, and then Tommy Richardson's father, Big Jim Richardson, approached them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes.
Well, well, Big Jim said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Harold Pemberton and his little boy. Folks, I'd like you all to meet Harold's son, Marcus. Take a good look, because this might be the last time you see him in here.
The laughter that followed was cruel and sharp. Children began to point and whisper. One little girl, no more than 8 years old, asked loudly, "Why is that boy brown if his daddy is white?" Another child answered, "Because his mama is one of them." Harold felt something break inside him that day. Not just his pride, but something deeper. The looks of disgust from people he'd known his whole life, the way they physically recoiled from his son, the way they looked at Harold like he'd committed some unforgivable sin. It planted a seed of doubt that would grow into something poisonous. Marcus, sweet 7-year-old Marcus, handled it better than his father did. He held Harold's hand tight and said, "It's okay, Daddy. We don't need to stay where we're not wanted." But Harold was drowning in shame and rage, and a growing realization that his son would face this kind of hatred every single day of his life. And worse, that Harold's association with him would always make it harder for Marcus to be accepted anywhere. The ride home was silent, except for Marcus's quiet sniffling. When they pulled into their driveway, Marcus looked up at his father with those intelligent eyes and asked, "Daddy, why do people look at us funny when we're together?" Harold couldn't answer. He just sat in the car, staring at his beautiful, brilliant son, and felt the weight of a world that would never fully accept either of them. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed, Harold and Celestine had their first real fight about race. Not about love, not about their marriage, but about what their son's future would look like. "He's going to face this everywhere," Harold said, pacing their bedroom. "College, job interviews, dating everywhere he goes. People are going to see him and then look at us and wonder what's wrong with this picture. And that's our problem." "How?" Celestine shot back. "Harold, we cannot control other people's ignorance. We can only control how we respond to it. But maybe—" Harold stopped pacing, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Maybe Marcus would be better off without me. Maybe if I wasn't in the picture, if he just had you, he'd fit in better with the black community. He wouldn't be stuck between 2 worlds." Celestine stared at her husband like he'd grown a second head. "Harold Pemberton, are you seriously suggesting you abandon your son because some ignorant people at a country club made you uncomfortable?" "It's not about me being comfortable," Harold exploded. "It's about what's best for Marcus. Do you think I don't see how people look at him when he's with me? Do you think I don't know that my being his father makes his life harder?" "Your being his father makes his life complete," Celestine said firmly. "Marcus loves you, Harold. You're his hero. You cannot let other people's hatred make you doubt that." But the seed of doubt had already taken root. Over the next 6 months, Harold began to withdraw. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious. Too cruel. Instead, he pulled away slowly, like a tide receding inch by inch until suddenly the shore is bare. It started with work. Harold began taking jobs farther and farther from home, staying away for longer periods. When he was home, he was distant, distracted. He stopped helping Marcus with homework, stopped reading him bedtime stories, stopped teaching him how to throw a baseball in the backyard. Marcus noticed first. Children always do. "Daddy doesn't like playing with me anymore," he told Celestine one evening after Harold had come home and gone straight to his workshop without even acknowledging his son. "Daddy's just tired from work, baby," Celestine assured him, but she was beginning to suspect something deeper was wrong. The truth was, Harold was conducting his own terrible experiment. He was testing whether Marcus and Celestine would be happier without him. He told himself he was being noble, sacrificial, that he was slowly removing himself from their lives to spare them the pain of being associated with him. But what he was really doing was looking for an excuse to run. The excuse came in the form of a job offer in Tennessee. A construction company in Nashville wanted Harold to oversee a major project, a year-long contract that would require him to relocate. The money was incredible, more than Harold had ever made. But more importantly, it was an exit strategy. Harold presented it to Celestine as a temporary separation. "Just 1 year," he said. "I'll send money every month, and I'll visit when I can. When the project is finished, we'll reassess." Celestine saw right through him. "Reassess what, exactly?" "Whether this is working," Harold said quietly. "Whether we're doing the right thing for Marcus." "The right thing for Marcus is having both his parents love him and support him and be present in his life," Celestine said. "The right thing for Marcus is not having his father abandon him because the world is cruel." But Harold had already made up his mind. He'd convinced himself that leaving was an act of love, that Marcus would be better off without a father who brought him shame and hardship. 3 weeks later, Harold packed his truck and drove away from Millbrook, Alabama. He kissed Marcus goodbye and promised he'd be back soon, but they both somehow knew it was a lie. Marcus was 8 years old when his father left. He stood in the driveway waving until Harold's truck disappeared around the corner, then turned to his mother and asked, "When is Daddy really coming home?" Celestine knelt down and pulled her son into her arms. "I don't know, baby. I honestly don't know." Harold did send money, faithfully, every month for the first year, but the visits he'd promised never materialized. The phone calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. By the time Marcus turned 10, Harold Pemberton had become a ghost, a presence felt only in the monthly checks that arrived without any personal note or explanation. Marcus, being the brilliant child he was, began to piece together his own version of the truth. His father had left because Marcus wasn't good enough, wasn't white enough, wasn't the son Harold had really wanted. It was a wound that would shape everything about how Marcus saw himself and his place in the world. Celestine tried to fill the void. She threw herself into raising Marcus, pushing him academically, encouraging his dreams, being both mother and father, and Marcus, perhaps to prove his worth to the father who'd abandoned him, excelled at everything he touched. But late at night when the house was quiet and Marcus thought his mother was asleep, Celestine would hear him crying into his pillow, calling for a daddy who would never answer. Meanwhile in Nashville, Harold was building a new life, or rather rebuilding his old one. He'd reverted to being the man he was before he met Celestine. He dated white women exclusively, worked construction jobs, drank beer with the guys, and never mentioned his wife and son back in Alabama. When people asked if he had kids, Harold would pause for just a moment, long enough to remember Marcus's smile, his laugh, the way he used to run to the door when Harold came home from work, and then he'd say, "No, no kids." Each time he said it, it became a little easier. Each time he denied Marcus's existence, he buried the guilt a little deeper. But you can't outrun your conscience forever. 13 years passed before Harold learned the truth about what his abandonment had cost. It was 1998, and Harold was working a job in Birmingham, close enough to Millbrook that he could have driven there in 2 hours. But he'd convinced himself there was no point. Marcus would be 22 now, probably didn't even remember him, was better off without him. Harold was having lunch at a diner when he overheard 2 construction workers at the next table talking about some local news story. "Did you see that article about that kid from Millbrook who got into Harvard Medical School?" One of them said. "Full scholarship too. Marcus Washington, I think his name was..." Harold's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Marcus Washington, not Marcus Pemberton. His son had taken his mother's maiden name, had erased Harold completely from his identity. "Yeah, I heard about that," the other worker replied. "Isn't that the kid whose white daddy ran off when he was little, left his mama to raise him alone?" "That's the one. Apparently the kid was some kind of genius. The valedictorian, class president, got perfect scores on everything. But get this, in his graduation speech, he talked about how being abandoned by his father motivated him to succeed, said he was going to become a doctor so he could save people, unlike his father who was too cowardly to stay and fight for his family." Harold felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He left money on the table and walked out of the diner in a daze. Marcus had not only survived without him, he'd thrived. He'd become everything Harold had dreamed he could be, and more. But the cost of that success was written in the bitterness of Marcus's graduation speech, in the way he'd legally changed his name to erase any trace of Harold's existence. For the first time in 13 years, Harold allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd done. He'd abandoned a brilliant, loving child who had needed him. He'd broken Celestine's heart and destroyed his own family because he was too weak to face the judgment of people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered. That night, Harold drove to a Peary phone and called information, asking for Celestine Washington in Millbrook, Alabama. His hands shook as he dialed the number. Hello. Celestine's voice was exactly as he remembered. Warm, strong, beautiful. Celestine, it's Harold. The silence stretched for so long that Harold thought she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke, her voice colder than winter. What do you want, Harold? I heard about Marcus, about Harvard. I wanted to... You wanted to what? Congratulate yourself. Take credit for raising a son you haven't spoken to in 13 years. No, I wanted to apologize. I know I can't make up for what I did, but... You're right, Celestine cut him off. You can't. Do you know what your son went through because of your cowardice? Do you know how many nights he cried himself to sleep wondering what he'd done wrong to make his father leave? Do you know how hard he's worked to prove he was worthy of love because the one man who was supposed to love him unconditionally walked away? Harold was crying now, ugly sobs that he couldn't control. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought he'd be better off. You thought it would be easier for you, Celestine said sharply. Don't you dare try to make your abandonment sound noble. You left because you were a coward. Pure and simple. You let other people's racism matter more than your own son's well-being. Is he happy? Another long pause. When Celestine spoke again, her voice was softer but no less firm. He's successful. He's brilliant. He's going to be an incredible doctor. But happy? I don't know that Marcus has ever really been happy. He's spent his whole life trying to prove he's worthy of love. And I don't think he'll ever believe he is until he deals with what you did to him. Could I talk to him? He's at Harvard, Harold. He's building a life, and you're not part of it. You gave up that right a long time ago. The line went dead, and Harold stood in that phone booth for 20 minutes, crying for the son he'd lost and the life he'd thrown away. But that conversation, painful as it was, lit a fire in Harold. For the first time in years, he felt something other than the dull ache of guilt. He felt determination. Harold began to follow Marcus's life from a distance. He learned that Marcus was not just excelling in medical school, but breaking records. He was the first in his class, the youngest student ever accepted into the pediatric surgery program, a rising star who was already being courted by the best hospitals in the country. More importantly, Harold learned that Marcus was engaged to a beautiful young woman named Dr. Amelia Richardson, a fellow medical student whose family had welcomed Marcus with open arms. They were planning a wedding for the summer after graduation, and from the pictures Harold found in the local newspaper, Marcus looked genuinely happy for the first time in years. Harold made a decision that would change everything. He was going to attend that wedding. He was going to see his son get married, even if he had to do it from the back of the church where no one would notice him. He was going to witness this moment of joy in Marcus's life, and then maybe he could find a way to ask for forgiveness. What Harold didn't know was that fate had other plans. The wedding was beautiful, a perfect spring day in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with cherry blossoms in full bloom and sunlight streaming through the windows of the historic church where Marcus and Amelia had chosen to say their vows. Harold sat in the very last pew, partially hidden behind a pillar, wearing his best suit and trying to make himself invisible. He'd driven 16 hours straight from Nashville, running on coffee and determination and the desperate hope that seeing Marcus happy would somehow ease the guilt that had been eating him alive for 15 years. Marcus looked magnificent in his tuxedo, tall, confident, radiant with joy. He'd grown into a handsome man, and Harold could see traces of both his parents in his face. Celestine's intelligence in his eyes, Harold's stubborn jaw, a smile that was entirely his own. The ceremony was everything a wedding should be, full of love, laughter, and hope for the future. Marcus's best man gave a speech about overcoming adversity and never giving up on your dreams. Amelia's father welcomed Marcus to the family, calling him the son I never had but always hoped for. But it was Marcus's own speech that nearly broke Harold's heart. I want to thank everyone who's here today, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. When I was growing up, I used to wonder if I'd ever have a family of my own. My father left when I was 8, and for a long time I believed that meant I was unlovable, that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Harold's chest tightened. Every word was a knife twist of guilt and regret. But my mother, Celestine Washington, taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to stay, who choose to love you through the hard times, who choose to believe in you when you can't believe in yourself. Mom, you were my father and my mother both, and everything I am today is because of your strength and love. The applause was thunderous. Harold wiped tears from his eyes and started to stand, ready to slip out before anyone noticed him. That's when Marcus said the words that changed everything. I also want to say something about forgiveness, Marcus continued. For a long time, I carried anger about my father's abandonment. I let it fuel my ambition, but I also let it poison my heart. But Amelia has taught me that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. So today, in front of all of you, I want to publicly forgive Harold Pemberton, wherever he is. I forgive you, Dad. And if you're listening, I want you to know that despite everything, I still love you. I still wish you could be here to see the man I've become. Harold collapsed back into the pew, sobbing openly now. Several people turned to look at him, but he was beyond caring. His son, his brilliant, generous, beautiful son, had just publicly forgiven him, had declared his love for him in front of 200 people. After the ceremony, as guests were filing out, Harold tried to slip away unnoticed, but Celestine spotted him from across the church. Their eyes met, and Harold saw something in her face he hadn't expected, not anger, but sadness. She made her way through the crowd until she was standing in front of him. He meant it, she said quietly, about forgiving you. I know, Harold whispered, and I don't deserve it. No, you don't, but that's what makes it forgiveness instead of justice. They stood there in silence for a moment, watching Marcus laugh with his new wife, surrounded by friends and family who loved him. He's extraordinary, Harold said. Yes, he is, and he did it without you. The words stung, but Harold knew they were true. I know. I wanted to see him happy. I wanted to see him succeed. Well, now you have. What are you going to do about it? Harold looked at Celestine, confused. What do you mean? Are you going to spend the rest of your life hiding in the back of churches, watching your son's life from a distance? Or are you going to find the courage you should have had 22 years ago and try to be part of his life? Before Harold could answer, Marcus appeared beside them. He'd been making his way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes, when he spotted his parents talking. Mom, is everything? Marcus stopped mid-sentence as he turned and got his first clear look at Harold in 15 years. Father and son stood face to face for the first time since Marcus was 8 years old. Harold saw the little boy he'd abandoned in Marcus's eyes, but he also saw the man Marcus had become: strong, successful, compassionate, despite having every reason to be bitter. Hello, son, Harold said quietly. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He studied Harold's face, taking in the years of wear and guilt and regret. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. Hello, Dad. They shook hands like strangers, which in many ways they were, but it was a beginning. The conversation that followed was awkward, painful, and necessary. Marcus introduced Harold to Amelia as my father, the first time he'd claimed Harold as family in over a decade. They talked briefly about Marcus's work, his plans for his residency, his hopes for the future. But the real conversation happened 3 days later, when Marcus called Harold at his hotel. I'd like to talk, Marcus said. Really talk, not wedding small talk, but about what happened. About why you left. About where we go from here. They met at a small cafe near Harvard Medical School. Marcus looked tired. The wedding festivities had been followed by final exams and residency interviews. But he also looked determined. I need to understand, Marcus said without preamble. I've spent 15 years trying to understand why my father walked away from me, and I've never come up with an answer that makes sense. So I'm asking you directly, why did you leave? Harold had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times in his head, but sitting across from his son, all his prepared speeches crumbled. I was scared, he said simply. I was a coward, and I was scared. Scared of what? Scared of what the world would do to you because of me. Scared that having a white father would make your life harder. Scared that I wasn't strong enough to protect you from the hatred and judgment. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing this. So you decided to protect me by abandoning me. I thought, Harold's voice broke. I thought maybe if I wasn't in the picture, you'd have an easier time fitting in somewhere. With your mother's family, with the black community. I thought you'd be better off without me. Did you ever ask what I wanted?
You were 8 years old.
I was 8 years old, and I worshipped my father, Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. Do you know what 8-year-old me would have chosen? I would have chosen to face every bit of hatred and judgment in the world as long as I could do it with my dad by my side. Harold was crying again, but Marcus continued, his voice steady but filled with pain. Do you know what actually happened after you left? I didn't fit in anywhere. I was too white for the black kids, too black for the white kids, and too abandoned for anyone to fully trust that I wouldn't disappear on them too. I spent my entire childhood and adolescence feeling like I wasn't good enough for anyone, including the man who was supposed to love me no matter what. Marcus, I'm so sorry.
I'm not finished.
Marcus's voice was firm but not angry. I spent years hating you. Years. I used to fantasize about becoming successful and famous just so you'd see me on TV or in the newspaper and regret leaving. I wanted you to suffer the way I suffered. Harold nodded, understanding that he deserved every word. But then I met Amelia, and her family showed me what unconditional love looks like. Her father told me that real love isn't about protecting someone from hardship. It's about standing with them through hardship. And I realized that you didn't leave because you didn't love me. You left because you loved me the wrong way. Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. You loved me like you were doing me a favor by disappearing. But what I needed was for you to love me like you couldn't imagine life without me. What I needed was for you to look at the world's hatred and say, I don't care what anyone thinks, this is my son, and I'm proud of him, and anyone who has a problem with that can go to hell. Harold was sobbing openly now. You're absolutely right. I failed you in every way. A father can fail a son. Yes, you did, Marcus agreed. But here's the thing. I forgave you, years ago, not for your sake, but for mine. I couldn't carry that anger anymore. It was poisoning everything good in my life. They sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Harold spoke.
Is there any chance at all that we could start over? Not pretend the past didn't happen, but maybe build something new?
Marcus considered this carefully. I don't know, he said honestly. I'm not the same person I was when you left. I'm not that little boy who just wanted his daddy to come home. I'm a grown man with a wife and a career, and a life that doesn't include you. I don't know if there's room for you in it. I understand. But Marcus continued, I'm willing to try, slowly, carefully, with no expectations and no guarantees. I'm willing to see if we can build something resembling a relationship. It wasn't the instant reconciliation Harold had secretly hoped for, but it was more than he deserved. It was a gift. What would that look like? Harold asked. It would look like you proving that you've changed. It would look like you showing up consistently, not just when it's convenient. It would look like you earning back trust that you destroyed, and it would look like you accepting that there are consequences to abandoning your child. Consequences that don't just disappear because you're sorry. Harold nodded. I can do that. I want to do that. We'll see, Marcus said. But for the first time since Harold had walked back into his life, Marcus smiled, a small, cautious smile, but genuine. That was 12 years ago. Today, Harold is 69 years old, and he spent every day since that conversation trying to earn back his son's trust. It hasn't been easy. There were setbacks, arguments, moments when Marcus pulled away and Harold thought he'd lost him again. There were family dinners where Harold felt like an outsider, medical school graduations where he wasn't sure if he belonged, and grandchildren's birthdays where he wondered if he'd ever be more than a stranger who shared their DNA. But Harold never gave up. He moved back to Alabama, close enough to visit but far enough to give Marcus space. He attended every surgery celebration, every anniversary, every family milestone. He learned to be present without demanding attention, to offer support without expecting gratitude. Most importantly, he learned to love his son the right way, unconditionally, consistently, and with the fierce pride he should have shown from the beginning. Marcus, now a world-renowned pediatric neurosurgeon, has 2 children of his own, Harold Jr., age 8, and Celestine, age 5. They call Harold Grandpa, and they love him with the uncomplicated joy that only children can offer. Last month, Harold Jr. came home from school, upset because some kids had made fun of him for having a grandfather who was a different color than his father. Harold was babysitting that day, and his heart broke as he watched his grandson struggle with the same kind of prejudice that had once driven Harold to abandon his own son. But this time, Harold didn't run. This time he sat down with his grandson. Some people are going to have a problem with our family because we don't all look the same. And you know what? That's their loss, because our family is beautiful, and we love each other, and that's all that matters. But why do they care what we look like? Harold Jr. asked. I don't know, buddy, but I do know this. When people try to make you feel bad about who you are or who your family is, the best thing you can do is love even harder. Can you do that? Harold Jr. nodded, and Harold pulled him into a hug, marveling at how much courage it had taken his grandson to ask a question. Harold had been too cowardly to face 35 years ago. That evening, when Marcus came to pick up the children, Harold Jr. ran to his father and said, Dad, Grandpa told me that some people might not like our family because we're different colors, but that just means they don't understand how awesome we are. Marcus looked at Harold over his son's head, and for the first time in 12 years, Harold saw complete approval in his son's eyes. Not forgiveness. They'd moved beyond that long ago. Not acceptance that had been earned through years of consistency, but approval. Pride. Love. That's exactly right, Marcus told his son. Grandpa is very wise. As Harold watched Marcus drive away with the grandchildren, he thought about that day 15 years ago when he'd collapsed in his chair, watching his son on the evening news. He thought about all the years he'd lost, all the moments he'd missed, all the damage his cowardice had caused. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't give Marcus back the father he'd needed as a child, couldn't spare him the pain of abandonment, couldn't undo the years of doubt and anger and hurt. But he could be present now. He could love his son and his grandchildren with the courage he'd lacked as a young man. He could be the grandfather Harold Jr. and Celestine deserved, the father-in-law Amelia had graciously welcomed, the support system Marcus had needed all along. Sometimes redemption doesn't look like a Hollywood ending. Sometimes it looks like showing up every day, loving people who have every right to turn you away, and proving through actions rather than words that you've learned to love the right way. Harold Pemberton spent 35 years living with the consequences of cowardice, but he spent the last 12 years learning that it's never too late to choose courage, never too late to fight for the people you love, never too late to become the man you should have been all along. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very persistent and very sorry, love really can conquer all, even the deepest wounds, even the longest separations, even the most shameful abandonment. The son Harold walked away from McCain, the man who saved his father's soul. And that, more than any surgery he's ever performed, might be Dr. Marcus Washington's greatest miracle of all.